Good evening, everybody. Wonderful to see everyone here. Most of all, to see you, Professor Mendes-Flohr. Mazal Tov on the publication. Martin Buber, A Life of Faith and Dissent. I want to begin with the obvious question, which is, tell us about this title and what is inside the title. Martin Buber, A Life of Faith and Dissent.
Certainly. I would be remiss if I didn't begin by saying thank you. Martin Buber noted that perhaps the most precious word we have in all languages is todah, thank you. So I wish to thank Elliot, Rabbi Cosgrove, and your community for hosting this. Regarding the title, I'll begin by telling a story regarding Buber. One should note, before I even tell the story, that in the Middle Ages, both in Arabic and Hebrew and Latin, faith was a question of obedience. In the modern period, it's a question of choice. The most famous articulation of that is, of course, of Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian, who had a notion of a leap of faith. I'm not going to do that for you. Every time I leap, I trip. But nonetheless, it's a metaphor. It's a decision that we make rather than simply yielding to a tradition of being obliged. Buber tells the following story which led him to his understanding of faith. He was already in his youth a very famous individual. He wrote on mysticism and myth, gained a great reputation. One of his books, entitled Ecstatic Confessions, was considered one of the seminal books, one of the crucial books in development, what we call expressionism, literary expressionism. Many of the expressionist writers were beholden to the young Buber for his book on ecstatic confessions. And with that in mind, he gained a great deal of admiration, adulation within the larger community. In July 1914, a month before the outbreak of the First World War, Buber was visited by a very famous reverend, the father confessor of the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany. And he was what we now in our nomenclature would refer to as an evangelical Christian. He was excited about the possibility that war would come, a redemptive, catastrophic war. You perhaps recall in apocalyptic literature, we call it apocalyptic literature, the birth pangs of the Messiah, the Messiah will come to us. The advent of Messiah would be like the birth pangs of giving birth, agony. I witnessed 4 children. Two children of my own, and 4 of my daughter, giving birth. All you know, familiar with a great deal of pain before the glorious moment of giving birth. And that was used as a metaphor for apocalyptic redemption. So Rabbi Elliot said, war is going to break out. He came to Buber excited. It's coming, baby. He didn't. That's my interpolation. He was after a German. So, however, with great excitement. And he began to quote from the book of Daniel. In the Hebrew Bible, we have an apocalyptic book, the war between the forces of good and evil, which will lead us to the redemptive moment. And he was citing the book, the Reverend, with great enthusiasm, exuberance, his vision of a war which will lead to redemption, and of course the redemption of the Jewish people, returning them to the land of their ancient patronymy, the land of Zion. And as Buber led Reverend Heckler, was much older than him, back to his train, Reverend Heckler turned to him and said, "Tell me, Herr Buber, do you believe in God?" He had a sense that Buber wasn't really impressed by his enthusiasm. And Buber felt, well, I can't say no, but at least voice some ambiguity, lead Reverend Heckler to believe that Buber did believe in God. But Buber came home and said, why couldn't I say yes without hesitation? And it took him 2 years to realize. He said he was on a train, and suddenly it came like a bolt of light. And this is what he came to the conclusion. If to believe in God in the third person, that I can talk about God, excuse me, we tend to look
It's okay to speak like that in here.
Right. God does this, God is manifest in this fashion. I don't really believe. I can't believe. But if to believe in God means to feel that you're addressed by God in the second person directly, then I do believe. So let me expand upon what Buber understands by a second person address. And that address, the second person address, is first articulated in his book that we're all familiar with. For many years I claimed to have read it, but I never read it. But I nonetheless, I and Thou, the most famous book of Bubers, it came to give articulation of what he meant by second person address. That we are addressed individually by God in various moments in our lives. So let me say something about the book. The book is strange translation. Thou says thou today. It was really a translation from Old English, of course, but those of you who are familiar with German or Spanish, Italian, are familiar with the fact that there's two words for you. A more formal you, in German that would be Sie, and a more intimate you, the du. It's a very simple word, not thou, but du, you. And it's, in German, it's, as in other European languages, it's confined, that du, to the most intimate relationships between a parent and a child, between the closest of friends, and when we address God, even though God is understood, Melech HaOlam, the King of the universe, the Lord of the universe, we address God with the simple word du. So let me say something about the word du as it's understood by Buber. If I was speaking in a university, and you'll forgive me, it's a great sin to speak like a university professor, I would characterize the book I and Thou as a phenomenology of saying du. Forget a word by phenomenology, but our consciousness, our sensibilities of what accompanies us when we say du. And I'll preface that by noting that Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, another great philosopher of modern Judaism, occupies a chapter in the book, what we would call good friends. Certainly in the Midwest, where I've been teaching ever since I retired from the Hebrew University, friendship is instantaneous. It compels almost before you wink an eye. But Buber and Rosenzweig were close friends in any way we would conceive of friendship. They worked together in creating a new conception of Jewish education, which is, of course, reflected in your project. But they were, for 8 years, a friendship, still per Sie. So Buber would turn to Rosenzweig, Sie, and Rosenzweig would say Sie. And at one moment, Rosenzweig, who was a very ill man, wrote a poem, and inadvertently, so he said, addressed Buber with the du. Buber was 8 years older, and Buber replied, don't worry, we are now ready, after 8 years of friendship, to address one another with this little word, du. Behind it is the notion of cultivating trust. And Buber, in his much later writings, noted that the Hebrew word for faith is really trust. Actually, Moses Mendelssohn also, in his translation of the Hebrew Bible, noted that emunah in Hebrew is best understood as trust. But it takes a long time to develop the trust, genuine trust, with another human being. One of my dearest students, Jessica Brown, reminds me I should tell you a story about a snail. Buber notes that we all march through life protecting ourselves with armor. One of his closest friends, a psychiatrist and existentialist thinker, Karl Jaspers, noted that as a metaphor, as a way of understanding what is at stake with trust, by referring to a snail A snail encases itself in armor, in a shell, and very reluctantly exits the shell. And as soon as there's a shadow of a threat, creeps back into the shell. And that is true of most of us. The snail would only really exit that protective covering. In German, you've heard there's a shield, like a tank, when there's no threat, that he can trust the world around him or her. And only, of course, does the snail really express who he or she is by exiting the shell. But it takes a great deal of courage and trust. Such is the notion of faith for Buber. Now let me just, forgive me if I'm speaking too much.
No, but we got to get to dissent as well.
Right.
Dissent. We're only through one word.
Right. I'll give you the Jewish dimension of this trust. We already alluded to the fact that the Hebrew word for faith is best understood as trust. Buber lived in an environment where there was a very great deal of despair. We mentioned the First World War, and there was a collapse of any hope that the Enlightenment, the faith and reason will bring us into the paradise. And it gave birth to, and you forgive me again, an academic term, to what we call neo-Gnosticism. The word Gnostic comes to word you're familiar with is when you say somebody's agnostic, I really don't know. But it comes from the Greek word knowledge, gnosis. Period roughly when the birth of Christianity, there was a large movement of various expressions of what we now call Gnostic movements, claiming that the world we live in is a horror, it's a mistake. Our souls should have been residing somewhere else. And Gnostics provided knowledge, arcane, secret knowledge, how to escape the agony of a life in the flesh, riddled by ultimately death, uncertainty, temptation, born of our flesh, and the like. So, in the wake of the First World War, there was an efflorescence of Gnostic moods, a departure from any notion that the world is created and behold, it is good. Buber and his Franz Rosenzweig alike, and other Jewish thinkers, said Jews cannot yield to Gnostic anxieties. We must affirm creation, that the world is good, not only good, but very good. Yehi tov ma'od. But that takes a lot of courage, because we all experience the world indeed is fractured, fraught with pain and anguish, and you cannot yield to that everyday experience that leads us to doubt. We shall continue to affirm life. Such we have the expression, l'chaim. It doesn't mean to have a nice drink. It means to affirm life despite our awareness of all the difficulties that we encounter. And that means trust. But trust, first and foremost, also with our fellow human beings. And behind our fellow human beings is the presence of God. So Buber put great emphasis on our interpersonal relations as an expression of faith, religious faith. Thus we come to the word thou. The third part of the line, thou, Buber introduces God as the eternal thou, who's always there to say you. In the German, it's you, but we wanted to capture the religious dimension, echo, thou, although it obfuscates, it obscures the religious sort of everyday expression that Buber was concerned with. And that also brought him, I'll be brief, to Hasidism. Hasidism, as he understood it, was to learn to worship God in every aspect of life. Not only in the synagogue, certainly in the synagogue, but when you go to Fifth Avenue or worse, worse because I just had a meal, $50 for a little sandwich. I can't believe it. How do you manage?
Well, welcome to the Upper East Side.
Right. To serve God in the everyday of all its difficulties and disappointments. And it does encourage and demand a great deal of spiritual strength to affirm life with our fellow human beings. Especially, I don't know if I can get away with this, but especially in the age of Trump. But you'll forgive me for that. Anyway, you know what I was trying to say. Yeah. Thank you.
So just to build on this, Professor, and this, the book is a biography, but his theology and philosophy are all intertwined, which raises a question of the degree to which one's theology recapitulates biography. And this really comes out in the first few chapters of a young Buber who is abandoned by his mother, raised by his grandfather, who's a man of both means and Jewish learning. He marries out of the faith, keeps that relationship a secret from his grandfather, I believe, as well as the birth of his children. So really a very complicated biography, certainly in his early years. And he comes out with this notion of dialogue, of the potentiality of intimacy with another human being. And I don't know, I don't want to be an armchair psychologist here, but to the degree that one's emergent from the other, I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, indeed. As noted, and you perhaps have already read the book, or when Buber was a child of 3 years old, his mother suddenly abandoned the family, eloped with a Russian lieutenant, and young Buber ran to the a window, a little balcony, and waved, and his mother turned around to acknowledge that waving. To the very end of his life, he died at the age of 86, the pain of a mother who abandoned him remained as chiseled in his soul, lacerated his very being. That, I surmise, rendered human relationships that much more important. A very good friend of mine in Jerusalem, well, he actually lives in Herzliya, I live in Jerusalem. My home is actually in Jerusalem. A poet of renown notes in his poetry that the one love that we have that really remains firm is that of a mother. A mother's love is unconditional. All other loves you have to renegotiate, ideally, of course. He lacked that. He sought, well, this, I mentioned in the book, when he finally yielded to the gestures of his future wife, he wrote a love letter, a very unusual love letter, at least I would find it. He said, the first acceptance of a love, he concluded by saying, now I realize what I am missing in my life, a mother. Imagine writing a love letter. You're my mother. But that's the maternal warmth and support that he gained from his wife was of overarching significance. But it also meant that he was aware of how fragile relationships are, how often you can be abused by reaching out to the other, misunderstood. So he even created a word, sounds in German, it's Vergegnung, means a mismeeting. Most of our attempts to reach out to others are perilled by mismeetings. But that became his overarching concern, and it became a question of faith, not to yield to despair. One of Buber's disciples, the great Jungian psychologist Menachem Neumann, perhaps the most cherished pupil of Jung, wrote a book called The Great Mother, which echoed those concerns. Motherhood is the source of life. We make it very strong in Hebrew and Arabic by chance. You know, the Hebrew word for compassion comes derived from the word for womb. Rachmanut is a rachmunis, we perhaps say in Yiddish, derived from the Hebrew word rechem, which is the womb. That was ruptured, and perhaps ruptured to all of us at one level, but how to restore the warmth, the security of the womb. And thus
So to that degree, there's a direct connection between
I believe so, yeah. As another, forgive me, a little lesson. I'm an incorrigible teacher. I once brought my daughter when she was 9 to the university, in Hebrew University, and she wanted to know what her father does. So she came home after attending my class, and Mom said, her name is Inbal. Inbal, how is Dad's teaching? She goes, I'll say in the Hebrew, Mom. I said, Abba milamed shtoyot, Dad teaches nonsense. She got it right, but nonetheless, but nonsense with big polysyllabic words and such. However, let me just say, there's a German word that's derived from the word to give birth. It's called Geborgenheit. You probably know the term. It means warmth, security, and in some sense, Buber sought Geborgenheit, which was deprived of him as a child. But we can create in our relationships that Geborgenheit, and to render the world in which we live, God's creation, as Geborgen in that sense.
Right.
Please.
So, of all of the tools within the Jewish toolbox by which someone can access this intimacy with the divine, Buber wrote, I believe, the categories of Torato, one's relationship to a sacred text, Amo, one's relationship to a sense of peoplehood, and Atzmo, the self. Missing in that is mitzvot. Missing in that it's mitzvot. And there's an entire chapter in your book on Buber's relationship with Rosenzweig and their give and take on the matter of whether mitzvot are or are not a means by which to give expression, or, well, this is Heschel's word, the leap of faith. And it strikes me that Buber had a disdain for rabbinism. And I'm wondering if you could paint a picture of how this thinker who had such affection for all these other tools of Jewish expression, the idea of mitzvot just didn't do it for him.
Right. Well, first, mitzvah, of course, means command. And for Buber, God's commandments are not restricted, not confined to ritual actions. He was a member of a generation, a child of a generation, that came to a conclusion that what led to the outrage, the horror of the First World War and the collapse of the dream of the Enlightenment, that reason will bring us together, create a new harmony between human beings, was the separation of worship from the everyday. And he was joined with that view or that perception with Sigmund Freud. You read Sigmund Freud's works on the First World War, brilliant. And it comes to a similar conclusion. We teach our children not to steal, not to be angry, not to be deceitful. And when you look at the politics that led to the First World War, we steal, we kill. And that dissonance was a profound tragedy, and a tragedy that perhaps we still are alert to. Emerging from that, Buber's concern, together with people like Paul Tillich and others, I'm just throwing out a name, so forgive me, but very eminent individuals, is that we have to bring God out of this, not God into the everyday, into public life, not to limit God to synagogue or church, mosque. And so to recognize that God has mitzvot that should be heard in the everyday world. Again, he's inspired by the Hasidim in that respect. More biographical, when he was 3 years old, his father didn't know what to do with a child who has been abandoned by a mother and he by his wife. So he dispatched young Buber to live with his grandparents, Orthodox Jews. His grandfather was a great scholar of Midrash. His grandmother still wore a sheitel, a wig. She came from a Hasidic family. Very observant, but they failed to address Buber's agony. He says, I ask questions. He says, shh, don't worry about it. all they gave him is a regiment of Orthodox observance, which didn't allow him to come to terms with his sense of loss. He found the orthodoxy of his grandparents, whom he loved, to be oppressive. As soon as he went to the university at the age of 18 in Vienna, he abandoned everything Jewish. And later on, he found his way back to a Jewish identity, Jewish involvement in Zionism. But here's where the dissent becomes in. Zionism was a form of nationalism. That doesn't really satisfy, particularly Herzl's brand of Zionism as an answer to anti-Semitism. But he was concerned about the spiritual substance of Jewish life. And therefore, he eventually broke with Herzl. He returned to Zionism later in his life, had a sense of solidarity of the forlorn people. Solidarity with his fellow Jews, which he never gave up, although he was clearly dissatisfied, critical of the way Zionism had emerged. And that's his dissent. He was but the British have a notion of the loyal opposition. He remained in the loyal opposition, emphasizing that Judaism cannot be confined to ethnic identity or political identity. Our vocation as Jews is spiritual, not quite ethical. I mean, it's ethical, of course, but it's the spiritual dimension of being an ethical human being. There's mitzvot that cannot simply be confined to the synagogue. Although he certainly honored those who, like his closest friend was a man named Agnon, the great Hebrew author and Nobel laureate, who was an observant Jew towards the end of his life. If you read the book, the very end of it, it's something very touching. I had the privilege of knowing, I didn't know Martin Buber, but I knew his family, his son, his daughter, to a lesser extent, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. And the great-granddaughter, who was raised within Buber's home, together with her parents, noted that when Buber was on his deathbed, she ran home, she was 15, from school to see her grandfather, or her great-grandfather, and she found him in his last grasp with his hand in that of Agnon. So he certainly honored those who observed. Agnon felt that his way to faith and to Jewish expression was through the synagogue, the mitzvot as classically understood. But his concern was to have us reach out beyond the synagogue to the everyday, the way we make politics.
Right.
Yeah.
So you touched on Buber's Zionism.
Yes.
So I want to pivot to that, because both early on in his career, his engagement with and then disillusionment with the nationalism of Jewish peoplehood, and then, of course, post-1938 as a refugee or as an arrival in pre-state Israel in the Yishuv, and his philosophy of dialogue was front and center in terms of informing his views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm wondering if you could give us, is there a thread to Buber's relationship to Zionism, or are there different discrete chapters, different points of his life? Could you speak to Buber's relationship to Zionism?
Yes. I've already noted that the fundament of Buber's Zionism is solidarity with his fellow Jews, and a very critical moment, the rise of ferocious, barbaric anti-Semitism in the 20s, and of course then with the rise of the Third Reich. Buber remained in Germany that period, as was often referred to as the shepherd of German Jewry. He traveled throughout Germany in those conditions to uphold the faith. And that was what Buber was, as was suggested, by affirming our Judaism through learning texts. Not simply saying we're proud to be Jews, but we are spiritually engaged in the heritage of Judaism. So teaching, learning, in German and Hebrew, we should make a distinction between study, what you do in a university. You have to go to the Hebrew, less than a Hebrew university, but University of Chicago, go to the library, everyone's like this with the nervous legs. It's like a dance. And then you're examined, then you're subject to the critical evaluation. You have teachers and the like. It's brutal. It's not my children didn't go to the university. I wouldn't send them to the university. They're artists, they're creative people, but I would never send them to torture of. But they do study. I'm exaggerating a bit, but nonetheless. Judaism talks about learning, and learning is a very different activity than study. You learn in the community. You learn, to be spiritually and intellectually edified, not to garner a degree, but to somehow create a spiritual universe. And that's what Buber sought to give German Jewry in those perilous hours, until he was eventually the Nazis who kept him under surveillance, forbade him to teach, and then he finally emigrated to Israel. I should say, plug? It's the state of Israel. Israel are Jews everywhere. Those who live in Manhattan are Israel. Those who live in wherever, in Norway, are Israel. It's the state of Israel, and it's unfortunate that we tend to collapse the term Israel. Israel is the state of the Jewish people, of Israel. And Israel, of course, is a religious concept, not just the Jewish people. It's a religious concept. The children of the covenant are not simply an ethnic group that has history, etc., the Jews. And that was important to Buber. But with respect to the Palestinians, he noted that in Europe, the so-called Jewish question, and let me just give you a quick lesson. Forgive me, I'm certain you know what I'm saying better than I have to say. With the emancipation and the Enlightenment, was questioned, can we really include the Jews within this new polity, the liberal world? And there was hesitation, and not just amongst the riffraff. Hegel, Kant, all the great philosophers participated. What would really qualify the Jews to participate as our fellow citizens? After all, they're a strange Asiatic people. And that gave birth to the Jewish question. Finally is the wrong word, but ultimately, Hitler said, I have the solution that we've been searching for 150 years. A final solution, an absolute solution to the Jewish question, to eliminate them. So Buber, reflecting on that before the ultimate hour of the final solution, noted that the Jewish question that haunts Europe is ultimately a Christian question. It's a test of the resolve of the Christians, or to bring the sources of their faith to acknowledge and honor the Jewish people. In a similar fashion, analogous fashion, the so-called Arab question is ultimately a Jewish question. Whether we have the resources, the intellectual, spiritual, and ethical resources to solve our conflict with the Palestinians. And that cannot be solved simply by political maneuvering and the like. We had a fancy term called realpolitik, acknowledging the world is brutal. No. We are beholden by a spiritual heritage to seek somehow living with honor and dignity with our neighbors, our cousins, if you wish, the Arab peoples. And he never yielded that hope and that resolve.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to open it up for questions. I could actually keep speaking to you all night, but the amazing thing about Buber is, well, there are a lot of amazing things, but from his earliest years, his Hasidism, his I and Thou, his other, he's also, he lived till 1965, and in that sense, he's also a post-Holocaust theologian.
Right.
And I'm wondering, did Buber, if we think about that whole school of responses to where was God in the gas chambers, to what degree, and can you tell us how Buber, especially given his background, responded? Did he have a response theologically to the Shoah?
Yes, he did. Actually, in the 1940s, where the leadership of the Zionist community felt a certain distance from the Holocaust, the Jews who were left in Europe were like sheep going into slaughter. And they were embarrassed and associated with Ben Gurion and others. Buber was a member of a group called Al-Domi, which means do not keep quiet. We have to acknowledge the pain of our fellow Jews. And he was amongst the very first, and he gave a lecture here in, I don't know if it's a synagogue, but New York City in Manhattan in 1950, in which he spoke about, addressed the question of Auschwitz, faith after Auschwitz, perhaps one of the first articulations of that concern. He also spoke about the eclipse of God, like a sunset, but God is eclipsed by our rush to be modern, to be successful in a material world of achievement and the like. We've somehow blurred the vision of God, or maybe left God to certain moments that we call sacred life. But in terms of everyday life, God has somehow been eclipsed. And the challenge is somehow echoing his fundamental faith is this, to be attentive to God in every aspect of our lives.
Right. But it's interesting because he himself struggled with giving a full-throated faith in a God actively involved in our affairs earlier, and then to what degree that earlier Buber that you described a few moments ago informed the later Buber after Auschwitz.
If I just can correct you, forgive me for...
You corrected me for about 8 years of my life. You can keep doing it.
I shall. You said God is actively engaged in our lives. This question is how we are actively engaged with God in our lives.
Got it. Okay, so let's open it up and give everyone a chance to ask a question or two.
I wanted to just ask, with Buber, it's so easy to move towards universalism. How can we hold on to the Judaism part?
Right.
In terms of following Buber, that was one question. And then the other, I just wanted, that the Ich and Du, does one need a partnership for that? Because what if I'm an Ich and Du, but the other person is not?
They're excellent questions and actually hit at the heart of Buber's challenge to us. The favorite prophet of Buber was Amos. And Amos, if you recall, says to the Israelites, I'm not only your savior, I'm the savior of the Ethiopians and other peoples. He reminds Israel that Amos, you say Amos, not Amos, Amos, of the universality of God. So, and if you read I and Thou, Buber only mentions 3 Jews. You know who they were? Jesus, Peter, and Paul. Not me. I mean, that would be.
You would be a true prophet.
No. That's why you earned a doctorate from me. No. However, it's a universal statement, and Buber's understanding, as you correctly note, affirms the universality of God. So, what's specific about Jewishness, or Buber's Jewishness? It's the witness that we are. That we give. And the Hebrew Bible in particular, Buber understands as a dialogue. God spoke and we listened. It's difficult to listen. You know, we make a distinction, we should make a distinction between hearing, we hear what others say, but to really listen to what they say is much more difficult. And that's the way Buber interpreted the Hebrew Bible. Often Israel, the people of Israel, just heard God and then did whatever they sought to understand by God's word, or ignored it. The challenge was to listen. And the literature of Israel, beyond the Hebrew Bible, gives expression to the challenge of affirming a God of creation. Theologically, we say Buber is a creational theologian. His theology is not simply individual salvation, but firmly grounded in creation, and to render the world as really a witness to God's goodness. And that's the challenge. So it's a universal God, but Israel has a specific a contribution to articulating, to clarifying the universality of God. One of his last essays, Buber, addressing the Arab-Israeli question, he said, are we still the children of Amos? He said in Hebrew, B'nei Amos anachnu? Question mark. Are we still the children of Amos?
Thank you. And the second question was the question of universalism and
the asymmetry of relationships.
Yeah.
You know, mutual trust has to be cultivated. We often reach out to the other, and the other person is not really with us. And that's what makes dialogue so difficult. It's not simply I smile and you smile in response. It's learning to really listen to one another deeply. Let me just say something about listening. What brought Buber to understanding the distinction between hearing and listening. Listening is not only a question of hearing in the auditory sense. And he told the following. When he was still a very famous man, before he came to the notion of dialogue, people often sought him out. As you turn to famous people, he asked for their signature and the like, or want to have an exchange with them regarding some arcane academic issue. But one day, in the midst of the First World War, a bedraggled soldier came knocking on the Bubers' door, 6 in the morning. Can you imagine somebody knocking on your door 6 in the morning? Buber was already at his desk. And he saw the man was in great distress. He says, well, it is a bit early, but do come in nonetheless. And this bedraggled soldier said, I came watching all the way from the Austrian front. Buber was at the time living in the western part of Germany. I came by foot to ask you a question. Buber said, please, ask the question. And to signal that he only had a half hour, he took out his watch, you know, and a little, what do you call those? You know, a watch.
Pocket watch.
Pocket watch, yes. Very gently, but the signal was, I have a half hour to give you, which is very generous. Somebody come at 6 in the morning. And Buber said, he said, please. The man asked all the some questions, and Buber said he was very polite, cordial in answering those questions. The following day, Buber learned that this man committed suicide. And he realized that he failed to really listen to the true questions, the questions inscribed in the forehead of that individual, not those necessarily articulated through speech. And that's the challenge of dialogue, and it's an extraordinary challenge. And you're right. This man came to Buber hoping that Buber would be open. This is before Buber realized what the challenge of dialogue, and he wasn't. And throughout one's life, we reach out to others hoping they would exit their shell, you know, the snail image, and they don't. And that's what makes faith such an onerous challenge. It's not just simply a declaration of faith, it's a life of faith. And it is extraordinarily difficult, but we cannot yield. As Jews, and of course our fellow men and women are also urged to have that faith as well.
Thank you. Let's take another question.
Please.
Yes.
I was reading the biography of Rabbi Schneerson, and here's a man who loves everyone in the world, every Jew, whether it's Orthodox or not believing. There's one Jew he didn't really like, and that was Martin Buber, despite the fact that he did a lot to bring Hasidism and the tales into the forefront. Do you have any insight into why?
Or Schneerson didn't like Buber or regarded him? Yeah. Well, I think precisely what was alluded to before, because Buber didn't urge us to the ritual mitzvot. But the question of love is a very challenging notion. To love, it sounds like it's a big word, and we all have some understanding of love and how crucial it is in our lives. Again, a brief academic note. We have two terms in Hebrew for love, or two instances of love. And one is referred to as we should love God with all our might and such. That's technically, we call it, technical grammar, accusative. You love God with no inhibitions. But when we're in the Bible, it speaks about love of our neighbor, love of the strangers. It's a different grammatical form. And that love is not simply passionate love, as we would perhaps allow for ourselves regarding God. Especially Hasidim have a very ecstatic relationship to the divine, ecstatic love. But the love of the neighbor, the love of the stranger, is what we would call curative love, caring for them. You don't have to love your neighbor. You can find a neighbor vile, repugnant, and yet we're beholden to love the neighbor. You may say the same thing. The stranger in our midst may be our adversary, and yet we're still challenged to love the stranger. Why? Because we seek love as well. We want to be loved by our neighbors, and in circumstances where we are strangers, as we were in Egypt, as we perhaps were elsewhere in Europe, throughout the world, we're strangers, we want to be loved. But it's a different type of love, not ecstatic love, but it's a love of caring, being attentive to the other, even though we don't really like them. And I think that's missing in forgive me, in Schneerson's understanding of love within this particular expression or articulation.
Thank you very much. We have time for a couple more questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for your fabulous book, which really made it possible to begin to understand this unique individual.
Thank you.
But my question has to do with the effect of Rabbi Nachman
Yes.
on Buber. Because of all of the Hasidim, he seemed to be more influenced by Nachman than any of the other rabbis.
Right. Actually, the first book that Buber wrote on in Hasidus was Rabbi Nachman. And because he told us that there's so many ways of serving God. The very famous one is if you could go to a rabbi and just observe how he ties his shoes with a certain sense of sacredness. And it's true, we learn by exemplars in our lives. And that's what Buber also sought. Not just people who are very learned. In fact, those who are very learned tend to be the most difficult people. But even simple people have the nobility, the spiritual nobility that should not only instruct us but inspire us. And that's what Rabbi Nachman told us.
Did Buber eventually meet his mother, had relationship or never? And second question, what became of his children?
When his children were teenagers, they did have an occasion to meet the mother, and he said he couldn't look her in the eyes. He couldn't. He just felt deeply betrayed. But that was the only time that he didn't meet her. He wanted his children to know her, but it was very difficult for him. And Buber's children, yes, he had two children. Ava, the first son is Raphael, which was named after an uncle of Buber's who fell off a horse and died. And Raphael means God will heal. That was his first child, and then a year later, Ava was born. And both emigrated to the state of Israel, actually Palestine and the state of Israel. I was particularly close to Raphael Buber. And maybe perhaps this goes back to one of your questions. Raphael told me that his father told him, Raphael, whatever you do in life, you can be a shoemaker, you can sell cigars, but do it with integrity. He didn't urge his children to have an academic career, but just to have integrity in whatever they do. And so is Raphael. Raphael studied agricultural machinery in order to be a member of a kibbutz in the 1920s and 30s. And that's what he did. when his father passed away, Raphael had the responsibility for the literary and financial estate of his father, excuse me. And that's who he came to me. One aspect of his father's writings that he understood, because he was not an academic, was his father's engagement in Arab-Israeli or his Arab-Jewish relations. And his father wrote a great deal about those questions, but he wanted somebody who had an academic approach or credentials, and I was recommended to him. And we became very close friends for 15 years. Some of you may know the German custom of Abendbrot, 4 o'clock tea. Some of the British have it, something like that. Every day for 15 years, I was invited to Raphael Luber's home for Abendbrot. And he told me a great deal about his parents, of course. And he would call if I didn't make it. My daughter said, "Oh, once again, Raphael Luber's calling you," right? But his children were, in their own way, devoted to his legacy.
Thank you. So, last question.
You said that the Jewish question was actually a Christian question, but that question, the Jewish question arose, you were referring to the modern era in nation states. So I was wondering if you could clarify that. And also, you said that the Arab question is really a Jewish question, and I wondered if that is Buber's articulation, or you've written about that, or others have written about that.
The Jewish question was articulated as such already in the debates whether the Jews can be incorporated into the modern political structure, democratic liberal structure. And it gained in volumes, not volume, but in voice over the years, as I already indicated. Hitler offered the final solution to the Jewish question. The very fact that Europe, still beholden to Christian heritage, hesitated to include the Jews as fellow human beings or citizens, but citizens are fellow human beings. They regard them as fellow human beings who qualify for citizenship, according to Buber, was an indication of the failure of Christianity to draw upon questions of love and the like. There's lots of studies on the nature of modern anti-Semitism. Is it totally something new, or is it still draw upon anti-Judaism that had been part of the heritage of Christianity? So in that sense, the Jewish question is to be understood as a Christian question. Analogy for Buber was the Arab question. Of course, he meant that in a sermonic sense, in a way of urging us to not just to consider our struggle with the Palestinians and Arabs in general as a purely political struggle, but one that we would have to draw upon the wisdom of our tradition to solve in a way which honors the dignity of both ourselves and the Palestinians.
All right. So, Professor, just to close, and you can use this as an opportunity for anything we've missed out. You've studied Buber for decades. You have a relationship with his children. You're the custodian of the literary estate. You finally wrote a biography. So let me ask the question of relevancy, or what did you learn in this endeavor of writing this book about Buber that makes him more relevant than ever right now? And maybe even, I don't know if it's untoward to say, but to what degree is Buber a timepiece that does not speak to the present day?
You know, at least so it's said, all we do academically is an autobiograph. Clearly writing Buber as I understood Buber, and I understand him as refracted through his writings, but also his family, which I had the great privilege, and still have the great privilege of being an honorary member, I guess you would say. I learned a lot about myself. and why Buber is important to me. I do mention in the book that Buber was not a perfect human being, but he was perfectly human. And that's an important distinction. We all have our foibles, our fears, our inconsistencies, and certainly Buber had those fears. I mentioned that he had a beard. You know why he had a beard? Not to be a prophet. When he was born, the forceps grabbed his lip and he had a twisted lip. And it also affected his speech. As soon as he was able, in his adolescence, to have a mustache, began with a mustache, it was actually the lower lip, somehow, and then a beard. It somehow played into an image of a prophet, and it made him very, very uncomfortable. He didn't enjoy the role of being a prophetic image. He preferred to hide amongst his books. He was shy. He didn't have a disposition to be dialogical. For him, it was very hard. Some of us have a more open personality, but he didn't. But he knew it was a challenge, and it was difficult for him. And acknowledging or recognizing that his difficulty, I learned about my own difficulties, and also my own journey as a Jew, ultimately as a human being. So what I learned is not so much about Buber, but I learned about why Buber is important to me, and perhaps important to others as well.
Thank you. Professor Mendes-Flohr, we're honored by your presence. Mazal Tov on the publication. Please join me in thanking Professor Mendes-Flohr.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.